Thank you for joining us for another edition of the Mind of Christ. We're making our way uh, through the Gospels and the story of Jesus, so that we can understand His mind better. We're looking at things He did, things He said, so that we can get into the inner workings of His mind. We're transitioning into a brand new section here in A.T. Robertson's Harmony of the Gospels. This he calls, in general, this whole overall section uh, as the training of the 12 in the districts around Galilee. Specifically, we're in section 72 in this sequence. This is where Jesus is going to pull his disciples away to a lonely place so that they can have some time together, but he's interrupted by a large crowd, and this results in what we call the feeding of the 5,000. This is a particularly long section, and so I'm going to take it in some bites so that we don't overtax ourselves in trying to cover the material. Uh, Let me give you the text that are involved in this particular section, even though we won't get through all this material. So in Matthew, it is Matthew 14, 13 through 21. Matthew 14, 13 through 21. And then in Mark, it is Mark 6, 30 through 44. And then in Luke, it is Luke 9, 10 through 17. And in John, it is John 6, 1 through 14. So we may get through half of that today. We'll see how far we go. So let me read. I'm going to read from Mark and from John, at least part of Mark and John, in order to get some flavor for this section. So in Mark 6, starting in verse 30, Mark chapter 6, let me see, let me get the right one. Yeah, Mark chapter 6, verse 30. It says, "And the apostles gathered together with Jesus, and they reported to him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, Come away by yourselves to a lonely place and rest a while. For there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. And they went away in the boat to a lonely place by themselves. And the people saw them going, and many recognized them, and they ran there together on foot from all the cities and got there ahead of them. And when he went ashore, he saw a great multitude, and he felt compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it was already quite late, his disciples came up to him and began saying, The place is desolate, and it's already quite late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered and he said to them, You give them something to eat. And they said to him, Shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give them something to eat? Well, let's switch over to John, the book of John, chapter 6. And let me read just a little bit in this section. After these things, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, or Tiberias. And a great multitude was following him, because they were seeing the signs which he was performing on those who were sick. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Jesus therefore, lifting up his eyes, and seeing that a great multitude was coming to him, said to Philip, Where are we to buy bread, that these may eat? And this he was saying to test him, for he himself knew what he intended to do. All right. Well, let's dive into this section and see how much we can cover. This is a very large section. We'll be here for a while, not today, but over the course of the next few weeks. All four Gospels are included. I've given you the text already. The first thing that hits me is Jesus going away after the death of John. Remember, that's what we've been talking about, and so this is Jesus going away. Uh, but maybe that's not really as accurate as it seems, because when what we read in the previous section was actually a retelling of something that had previously happened. So even though Jesus is going away into a lonely place came after the story. It was the retelling of the story. It was not the actual event of John's death. So we have to be careful about making sure we understand uh, the conclusions that we're drawing about this. Uh, so it's so important to keep the sequence straight. The coming away was at the conclusion of the limited commission and all that happened while they were gone. Now remember, Jesus had sent them away on the limited commission. This was found in Matthew chapter 10. This is the apostles coming back to him, and that they are reporting different things that were going on. Um, I want to specifically look at the training of the 12 beyond this point. What and how and when and where it happened in Jesus' school. One of the side points I would make to you here is that even though Jesus taught for 3 years, his most intense training of the 12, the apostles, occurred in the last year of his life. In fact, he didn't even appoint them as apostles until well into his ministry. And so the training of the 12, the most intense training of these men, came in the last year of Jesus' life. So this section begins with Jesus needing to be alone with his disciples, though it says by himself. Matthew says when he heard it, meaning the death of John. This was the first physical casualty of the war against sin started by Jesus. The seriousness of confronting sin could not be more vivid than in the death of the Baptist. A head on a platter is a steep price for telling someone to repent in view of the kingdom being at hand. And though Matthew says by himself in chapter 14 and verse 13, in 14 and 15 the disciples are there. Mark 6 and verse 30 says the apostles gathered together with Jesus. Luke chapter 9 and verse 10 says, when the apostles returned, they gave an account to him. In John chapter 6 and verse 1 says that Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Luke chapter 9 and verse 10 says that Jesus took the apostles with him to Bethsaida. Of course, none of this means that Jesus could not have had some alone time during this period. Jesus traveled across the lake from south to north, since Bethsaida was on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. John says Jesus went up into a mountain. This is certainly plenty of opportunity for this in this region. There would have been ample places he could have gone up into the hills or the mountain. There seems to be two things going on as Jesus retreats with his apostles. First is his need to be alone and process John's death or other events that were going on. Can we begin to understand how this affected Jesus? He held John in high esteem, and it is the work of Jesus and his Father that contributed to John's death. Jesus could have prevented John from being executed. Did the image of John being tied to a stump with his hands bound behind him and with the executioner's sword raised high burn into his mind? And did this serve as a precursor for his own execution in a much slower and more painful manner? Mark says that the apostles reported. Are they reported all they did and taught? Remember, Jesus had sent them out on the limited commission. One strategy that Jesus used in the training of the 12 was retreat. The occasion of this retreat was, for there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. The coming and the going of people with their needs all pressing, all that must be solved now, most complicated was most complicated. How was Jesus able to walk away from life, even for a short period? Even as I am writing this, I am also filling out my to-do list. If we break down Jesus' words, one sentence we see the elements of a retreat. What is a retreat? What do we learn about a retreat from the words that we find here? First of all, to be on retreat means to come away. Retreat demands that we disengage from life as it is. There has to be a break. Notice we call it a break from normal responsibilities. Coming away is active and moves in a direction. It is a deliberate and intentional action. So the first thing about a retreat, it means to come away. Secondly, it means to come away by yourselves. Now this is plural in this case, but notice in Matthew 14 and verse 13 it says Jesus withdrew by himself. And in Luke 9 and verse 10, retreat can be and is effective with others who are in retreat. By himself. He did both. I wonder if Jesus set an agenda for his retreat. Up at 5 o'clock, quiet time, breakfast at 6, group time at 7. For some reason, I can't see him being so formal, though all these activities no doubt were part of his retreat. Well, I would think that there would be part of his retreat. Well, why by yourself or by yourselves or by himself? Why would you do that? Well, in a retreat, you need time to think and time to hear and time to process and time to purge out the din of life so that the voice of God can penetrate. It is time to reconnect with God and others. It may be a time to cry since life does not afford that opportunity very much. Situations and people bring stress. We need time to de-stress from our distress. By oneself allows us to turn off other voices so we can hear two voices, ours and God's. The third aspect of retreat is to a lonely place. The place is important. What makes a place lonely? It allows you to control being alone. It allows you to control being alone without unnecessary distractions. It is easier today than ever to have contact with someone. There's lots of options. Texting and the phone and email and tweets and chat and Skype and Facebook. This access is global. This morning I had an instant message from Kenya, a phone call from an assistant chief, an email from a battalion chief, a text reminders, and face-to-face, all before 8:30 a.m. But I also now, at 9:06, I'm sitting in a house alone, but only a click or a touch away from many folks. So am I really in a lonely place? For Jesus, it was not quiet so complicated. He needed to find a place off the beaten trail where access was difficult, though not impossible. People would have to work a lot harder to find him. A lonely place may be rustic or modern, natural or unnatural. It might involve shutting off the phone and putting an out-of-office reply on your email. And when I did my sabbatical a few years ago, I did not know how to plan one, and I'm not sure I got the most out of it. I may have had too much alone time by myself. But place is important. I love my ACA, but hardly go. I wish I had a hiking partner to share it with. Well, another aspect of retreat is rest. Resting is important, not just sleeping, but a break from responsibilities and stress. Rest is a New Testament theme. In Matthew chapter 11, 28 through 30, Jesus says, "Come to me and be yoked with me, and I will give you rest for your souls," for your psyche, is the word that's used here. Also see Matthew chapter 10, verse 39. Rest for your Rest is needed, of course, for life. When we spend so much effort and time trying to save or hold on to our physical lives through work and stress responses, we wear down physically, emotionally. Well, more for on the rest for the soul in another time. Regarding rest, consider that there are so many different places where rest is talked about. Of course, the Matthew 11:28 through 29, the context there is knowing and revealing the Father and the Son. That depends on coming or taking a yoke and learning and finding the rest. Rest is a gift. Rest is a gift. But if we're going to know God and know Christ, then we're going to have some time to spend in that endeavor. In Matthew 12 and verse 43, the unclean spirit is in waterless places seeking rest, but does not find it. In Romans 15 and verse 32, the context here is persecution, and Paul is trying to find refreshing rest in the company of someone else. In 2 Corinthians 2 and verse 13, it talks about not finding Titus. Paul had no rest in his spirit because he wanted to see his brother in Christ. In Hebrews 3 and 4, God makes an oath that they shall never enter my rest. Well, due to hardness of heart, provoking God, going astray in their hearts, not knowing his ways, due to disobedience and unbelief, the word was not united with faith. It was tied to, and this whole idea of rest in Hebrews 3 and 4 is tied to God's resting on the third day. God resting on the seventh day. The crossing into Canaan was not the rest that God ultimately had promised his people, but it was only a foreshadowing of that rest. The rest is a resting from work that it mentions here in this text. And it says that we are to give diligence to enter that rest. Any rest here is temporary and anticipates the final resting place of the soul. Well, is soul in Matthew 11:29 psuche? Yes. It is rest for the life force within us, which is restless, and is the link between body and spirit. Spirit must become dominant so that the soul will calm down and be content. Now in 2 Corinthians 2 and verse 13, Paul is seeking rest in his spirit. I am thinking that the key to rest is found in the domination of spirit over soul, and that soul is connected with flesh, which is also connected with the body. And since the body is animated and made alive by the soul, holding on to the soul becomes the focal point of life. The soul is made to feel more alive through the gratification of the flesh, which in turn causes the soul to lust for more and more, to feel even more alive. Give it a sense of security and a comfort that life is okay. This is seeking homeostasis through the flesh, which will never work, since it is in our spirit that we must be okay. Now, again, I hope you followed that, because that's probably the deepest thing I want to talk about today, because it's so important that when we find rest for our souls, the way we do that is allow the spirit within us, to become dominant over the soul. So much of life we're living in the soul part of life, of where we're just trying to make it through things. And so we need a time where we are resting, we're away from the demands of life, so that the spirit can come to the forefront and we can focus on that aspect of our lives. So based on the previous scriptures, it seems that rest involves these different things. Number one, being known and knowing. In Matthew 11:25 through 30, the theme is that Jesus and the Father know one another, and that this is an exclusive club until the Son begins revealing the Father to others, those who are seeking rest for their souls, the weary, the heavy laden. The process of finding rest involves being yoked to Jesus as a learner or a disciple or a student. This yoke or partnership is light because Jesus is gentle and humble in heart. As we are fully engaged in the process of knowing Jesus and the Father, which is the essence of eternal life, something quietens in our souls. Paul calls it contentment in Philippians chapter 4, and Jesus calls it joy in John 17. The alternative to knowing Jesus and the Father is self-knowledge and worldly knowledge, which feeds the flesh and in turn keeps the soul in drama and turmoil. There is a competition between what your soul desires and craves and what it actually needs. Somehow, all this is made real in our bodies, which feeds on food and sex and things excessively. Luke chapter 12, 15 and 16, Jesus warns about greed in every form. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions. And so your life doesn't consist in getting more and more and more. I did work on this phrase, but can't remember the Greek word here. But it seems like it was hold together. Possessions do not hold life together. Well, rest is a gift. Rest is a gift. That's another aspect of learning how to rest. It can't be earned, and a life that tries to secure rest as a right or a payoff doesn't work. Jesus secures our rest with his work. Jesus makes sure if we seek for rest, it is there to be found. Jesus shows us through knowing him where it is and then calls us to come follow him. Rest is not a wage to be paid like a day off for service. Rest is not something we can self-produce, but it is merely to be received, like many sitting at the feet of Jesus, or like Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus. While Martha rushes around, Mary chooses the better part. Another aspect of this retreat or rest is we have to do it for a while. Retreat is always for a while. It's not forever. There is a duration to it. It is like 1 Corinthians 7, the temporary, mutually agreed upon separation between a husband and wife for the purpose of prayer and fasting. Otherwise, separation becomes permanent and harmful and a way of disengaging from the world. Jesus was a doctor who needed to be with people. He was the shepherd of the sheep. He was the teacher who had students to train. He needed rest, but he didn't need to be away too long. It reminds me of the monastery in Haiti, devoted to seclusion, while down below in the valley the Haitians are living in poverty, hunger. Perpetual retreat is not healthy. We must be in the battle and advance. It is right to keep this in perspective. Jesus' retreats were often interrupted by the press of people who would find him. I wonder if he ever really got sufficient rest out of this retreat. So this is the anatomy of a retreat in Jesus' own words, a primer on getting away productively. I have a bed and breakfast coming up. I think I will pitch it to Brenda as a retreat and try to apply these principles. Mark says the occasion for the retreat was the coming and the going of many people, interrupting even Jesus' eating. The coming and going of people leave us worn and used. We see it visibly in our lives or in our homes. We see people, we see the crumbs, we see the spills, we see the broken things, those things that are out of place, perhaps missing things, supplies used up, trash, sinks full of dishes. But people also bring spiritual and emotional messes to us, and cause us to be worn on the inside. They tell stories. They needle. They share needs. They have criticism. There are anticipations of them leaving. There's praise. There's questions. There's arguments. There's stresses, and all the like that people bring into our lives. And all of these have some impact on us. All of these are taking and producing the need for retreat. Some good insights here, I believe. Well, Matthew says that he made his departure by boat, and the crowds followed on foot. It doesn't seem to allow for retreat. Mark says they went by boat to a lonely place, but the crowds got there ahead of them. As he went ashore, he felt compassion for all these shepherdless sheep. Luke says that the crowd caught up with him in Bethsaida and that he welcomed them. John indicates that Jesus went up into a mountain and sat with his disciples, and then saw the crowds coming to him. However, perhaps John is really saying that after a day of healing, as he sat on a hillside with his apostles, the crowds approached, and this was the opportunity for the feeding. I don't think Jesus at this point got to have his retreat. The people were too persistent. So here is a man in desperate need of rest, being pressured by people who will walk when he starts preaching. They came for the healing and the meal, but not for discipleship. Matthew says that when he came ashore, he felt compassion for the crowds, and he healed their sick. This seems to have lasted most of the day, because the feeding took place in the late afternoon. Mark says it was a great multitude, and he felt compassion because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he taught them many things. Again, it was getting quite late when the feeding began. What are sheep without a shepherd like? Vulnerable, unsupervised, leaderless, subject to predators, unable to find adequate provision? As the Good Shepherd, Jesus' heart is revealed here. The crowds needed Jesus in ways that they did not understand. The crowds needed physical healing, and he gave it. They needed bread, and he provided it. They needed to hear about the kingdom, and he taught them. They needed to know him, and he revealed himself to them. They needed more than they thought they did, but many did not follow because they did not recognize the shepherd's voice. Matthew describes the place as desolate, and so does Mark, and Luke, who adds that they needed to be sent to surrounding villages to find lodging or something to eat. This indicates that though Jesus came ashore at Bethsaida, he headed off on his retreat into the surrounding hills, but the crowds followed him. His retreat is interrupted, and he spends time preaching and healing. John mentions that the Passover was at hand. Robertson notes that this is likely the Passover before the crucifixion. We are entering actually the last year of Jesus' life. He also notes 4 separate withdrawals, and this is in sections 72, 78, 79, and 81. And so we're just in the one on 72. But there are at least 3 more withdrawals for retreat during this coming year. It seems he spent some special alone times with his apostles during this last year of his life. This is important to show that in Jesus' thinking, what was important to do during this precious and limited time on earth. Training and retreat go hand in hand, it seems. I've not valued this enough to implement it often enough in my ministry. It was nearing evening, late in the day, and the time had already passed, simply meaning it's getting late. Jesus decided to use this opportunity to teach his disciples a lesson. Specifically, he targeted Philip. And we're going to stop right there because now we're going to enter into the feeding of the 5,000. And we've covered enough material for today. But thank you for joining us, and I hope that you will check out our website, centralsarasota.org, and you'll find other materials there on the mind of Christ, as well as other recordings that we've made. So God bless you. Take care. And until next time.